very quickly, I got a question. I think this was from Reddit. The question was, does the glycemic index matter? With macro factor, a lot of our users, there's in any nutrition space, always questions about carbs versus fat. And then even further into that conversation, how do we choose our carb sources, good ones versus bad ones, and so on. So one of the things that comes up a lot is the glycemic index. And I cannot think of an index or a metric that has been misused more than this in the nutrition world. And I'll talk about the little instance where there might be a little bit of utility, but a lot of times we get this question about the glycemic index coming from people who are, generally healthy, fit, exercising. They're consuming mixed meals with all different sorts of foods in it, and they're like, should I be swapping out my carb sources for a lower glycemic index value carb source? So before we get into the applied stuff, the glycemic index, basically what you're looking at is the area under the curve. They look at the blood glucose response. You are in a fasted state, usually a 12-hour fast. They give you that food alone, so not a meal with that food, just that food, usually 50 net grams of carbohydrate worth of that food. You eat that. They look at blood glucose over 2 hours. If you have a huge blood glucose spike, usually that means it was a really fast digesting carbohydrate. Blood glucose goes really high in that initial period, and the glycemic index value is high. And they're all standardized usually against glucose, which would have a value of 100. So it's this quantification of relative to a standard, in many cases glucose, how much does this particular food spike your blood sugar in isolation in a fasted state? So that seems like a pretty good idea. Initially, it came out to help people with diabetes manage their acute blood sugar excursions in response to a meal. And especially before they had, I think nowadays, a lot of the insulin pumps, if you have a pump, are like automated. So they can kind of sense your blood glucose and then deliver the appropriate insulin dose. But I'll admit, I don't have diabetes, and no one in my family has ever had diabetes, but my understanding is that there's some degree of calculation going on before a meal in terms of like, okay, based on this meal, I might need to have this much insulin. Is that fairly accurate?
I don't know.
But anyway.
Yeah, that seems very plausible to me.
That's my understanding of why the glycemic index came out, was basically, hey, we need to help people with diabetes make some informed decisions about not just their food choices, but also, how are they going to manage insulin injections and things like that. So apologize if you're in clinical nutrition and I'm just completely stomping all over that. But the shortcomings of the glycemic index are numerous, especially in the context of healthy folks who are exercising a lot. So first of all, the glycemic index is measured with a set number of net carbs. Like I said, usually 50 grams. But that ignores differences in the energy density of a food, right? So like watermelon is kind of the classic example. They're like, here's 50 net carbs worth of watermelon, which is like...
So you just eat 7 kilos of watermelon.
Yeah, it's like a tremendous amount of watermelon. And so then it has this high glycemic index value, but it's very different from saying like, here is a serving of white bread and here is a serving of watermelon.
Yeah.
Like they're going to have different net carb values. So that's one of the issues there. It standardizes net carbohydrate, which completely ignores the context of serving size. Another thing is that the glycemic index, like I mentioned, usually measured in an overnight fast with a single food consumed in isolation. Most of the meals we eat, other than breakfast, are not in an overnight fasted state. So we're still digesting food from a previous meal. And then the foods that we eat are usually consumed, our carb sources are consumed along with usually a protein source, a fat source in various combinations. And when you start adding, fat and protein and different amounts of fiber into this mixed meal, it drastically can alter the dynamics of that glycemic response. So all of a sudden, this number that used to be very relevant is now getting distorted by interactions with other foods in the meal. And also, the glycemic index value of a food can change as a fruit ripens. It can change based on the way you prepare a carb source, the way that you cook it, and the degree to which you cook it. And it also just doesn't tell you about the quality of the food, right? So when you're looking at a carbohydrate source, you might be thinking about the vitamin and mineral content. You might be thinking about the fiber content, the energy density, the way your GI system tolerates that food if you're a little bit sensitive to it, the palatability of the food, the convenience of the food when it comes to cooking and storing. If you get into coaching, convenience of food sources is so important. Like you could have the best diet plan in the world put together, but if it's like, yeah, I don't know how to cook that and I can't store that and bring it to work, the whole thing is useless.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the cost of a food is important as well. So the glycemic index doesn't really tell you anything about those things. And in my opinion, those are some of the most important things to consider when you're evaluating a carbohydrate source. So, they have come out like after the glycemic index, they came out with the glycemic load, which I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the whole idea with the glycemic load was to account for that issue with standardizing the net carb content. I think glycemic load takes into account the kind of standard serving size in addition to like, the glycemic response. So the glycemic load is a little bit of a step up from the glycemic index, but it doesn't come anywhere close to solving all the other problems associated with the metric. So, uh, when I'm dealing with someone who is not diabetic, who is generally healthy, exercising, things like that, and they ask about glycemic index, my response is it's just really not worth worrying about. Um, the In all my years of coaching, I don't do diabetes management, which is why I know so little about it. I'm actually proud to not know about it because I shouldn't. Like,
Yeah.
if I'm getting in there like pretending to be the armchair diabetes counselor, like no, that's not what I'm here for.
Yeah.
So like, I don't do diabetes management. It's a critically important thing. It's just not my expertise, and I leave it to the people who are good at it. So
Yeah.
my caveat is if you're working with a medical practitioner, and they know your medical situation way better than I do, and they're telling you to be mindful of these different metrics with your carb choices. Of course, if you're under medical supervision working with a practitioner, take their advice. But I can tell you that outside the context of diabetes, where I do my work, I have never once considered or advised someone to put a lot of thought into the glycemic index. It is a very, very limited metric that has very limited utility outside of those clinical applications.